Remember your grandmother's Christmas cookie tin? That treasure chest demanding 3 weeks of relentless patience?
Every cookie took time, care, and quiet dedication. Not fast, not easy, but full of heart.
30 cookies dominated every Christmas from 1945 to 1985. These weren't simple drops. They were intricate masterpieces now extinct because daughters abandoned tradition for convenience. Today we grab pre-made dough and wonder why Christmas feels empty. Number 17, 80 brutal hours for one tin, will devastate you. Tonight, we're bringing them back all 30 before they vanish forever. The sound of the cookie press clicking announced serious baking commitment. That mechanical device with its interchangeable discs created perfect shapes that separated grandmothers who owned proper equipment from women who just dropped dough on sheets. Spritz cookies cost $2 and produced 120 perfect shapes. 1 cup of butter, half cup of sugar, 1 egg, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 2 1/4 cups of flour, and 1/4 teaspoon of salt mixed into dough stiff enough to hold intricate patterns. The cookie press required strength to operate. Weak hands couldn't force dough through those tiny openings that created wreaths, Christmas trees, and stars. Loading the press, selecting the disc, and pressing with consistent pressure created uniform cookies that announced technical skill. Smart grandmothers tinted portions of dough with food coloring, creating red and green cookies that looked festive arranged on platters. The buttery crispness and delicate texture made these disappear faster than any other cookie in the tin. Keeps 2 weeks in airtight containers. The spicy aroma of these German cookies announced cultural heritage and connection to old-world traditions that immigrant grandmothers refused to abandon despite pressure to become fully American. Feffanosa cost $3 and produced 200 small round cookies, 2 cups of flour, 1 cup of brown sugar, half cup of molasses, 1 egg, 1 teaspoon each, of cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and black pepper. Half teaspoon of baking soda created dough that had to age overnight before baking. The aging was essential. Fresh dough produced tough cookies, while aged dough created the characteristic crispy exterior and slightly chewy interior. Rolling the dough into marble-sized balls, baking until firm, then rolling warm cookies in powdered sugar created the traditional white coating. These cookies improved with age, developing complex spice flavors over weeks of storage. Grandmothers made them in November, storing them in tins where they mellowed and softened slightly, reaching perfect texture by Christmas. Keeps 1 month, improves with age. The sight of snowball-shaped cookies dusted with powdered sugar created the most elegant addition to any Christmas cookie tin, looking like they required professional pastry skills despite relatively simple preparation. Russian tea cakes cost $2 and produced 60 delicate spheres. 1 cup of butter, half cup of powdered sugar, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 2 1/4 cups of flour, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and 3/4 cup of finely chopped pecans mixed into dough that formed into perfect balls. The key was chopping those pecans into tiny pieces that distributed evenly throughout the dough without creating lumps that distorted the round shape. Baking until barely golden, then rolling warm cookies in powdered sugar, cooling completely, and rolling again in sugar created the thick white coating. These cookies melted in your mouth with buttery richness that made guests reach for seconds immediately. The name varied by region. Some called them Mexican wedding cookies, others called them snowballs. Keeps 10 days in airtight containers. The complex spice aroma of these German honey cookies announced baking expertise and willingness to work with challenging dough that required precise handling and patience most modern bakers lack completely. Lebkuchen cost $4 and produced 40 large cookies, half cup of honey, half cup of molasses, 3/4 cup of brown sugar, 1 egg, 1 tablespoon of lemon juice, 3 cups of flour, 1 teaspoon each of cinnamon, cloves, allspice, nutmeg, and ½ teaspoon of baking soda created sticky dough that had to be refrigerated overnight. The dough was difficult to work with, too sticky to roll without constant flouring, yet adding too much flour ruined the texture. Patient grandmothers chilled it thoroughly, rolled it on heavily floured surfaces, and cut shapes quickly before the dough warmed and became unmanageable. Glazing warm cookies with simple powdered sugar icing created the traditional shiny coating. The sound of the Pizzelle iron clamping shut announced Italian heritage and ownership of specialized equipment that most American kitchens didn't have, making these cookies exotic even in neighborhoods where Italian families lived. Pizzelles cost $3 and produced 70 thin waffle-patterned cookies, 6 eggs, 1½ cups of sugar, 1 cup of melted butter, 2 teaspoons of vanilla or anise extract, 3½ cups of flour, and 4 teaspoons of baking powder created thin batter that cooked in seconds. The Pizzelle iron required constant attention. 30 seconds too long and the cookies burned, 10 seconds too short, and they stayed soft instead of crisping. Experienced bakers developed timing instincts, listening for the sizzling to quiet slightly before opening the iron. These cookies could be shaped while warm. Rehook 5 cookies down, and you're seeing the pattern. Cookie presses requiring strength, specialized irons, precise timing. These weren't simple recipes. They were tests of patience and skill. 25 more cookies reveal why modern bakers gave up trying to match what grandmothers made look effortless. The sight of elaborately embossed cookies displaying intricate scenes and patterns announced German heritage and ownership of carved wooden molds passed down through generations, making these cookies family heirlooms as much as food. Springerle cost $2 and produced 60 large embossed cookies, 4 eggs, 2 cups of sugar, 1 teaspoon of anise extract, 4 cups of flour, and 1 teaspoon of baking powder created stiff dough that had to be rolled precisely 1/4 inch thick for proper embossing. The carved wooden molds or rolling pins pressed into the dough created raised designs, Christmas scenes, flowers, animals, religious symbols that required firm, even pressure to imprint clearly. Too light and the design barely showed, too hard and the dough stuck in the mold's crevices. Experienced bakers dusted molds lightly with flour, pressed firmly once, and lifted straight up to preserve crisp details. The sight of fluted tin molds stacked in grandmother's cabinet announced Norwegian heritage and commitment to making cookies that required pressing dough into dozens of individual molds, unmolding carefully, and washing each tiny tin by hand. Sandbakkelse cost $3 and produced 72 delicate tart-shaped cookies, 1 cup of butter, 1 cup of sugar, 1 egg, 1 teaspoon of almond extract, and 2½ cups of flour created rich dough that pressed into small fluted tins created cookies resembling miniature tart shells. The technique required patience, pinching small amounts of dough into each tin, pressing it evenly up the sides to create uniform thickness, trimming excess from the top. Uneven pressing created cookies that browned unevenly or stuck in the molds. Experienced bakers developed the feel for proper thickness, creating cookies thin enough to be delicate yet thick enough to unmold without breaking. Baking until barely golden, cooling briefly, then inverting tins and tapping gently released the cookies. The sound of dough sizzling in hot fat announced Norwegian Christmas traditions and willingness to deep-fry cookies, creating grease spatters and lingering cooking smells that modern kitchens avoid, but grandmother's kitchens embraced as part of holiday preparation. Fattigmann cost $2 and produced 60 diamond-shaped fried cookies, 6 egg yolks, 6 tablespoons of sugar, 6 tablespoons of heavy cream, 1 teaspoon of cardamom, and enough flour to make soft dough created mixture that had to be rolled paper thin and cut into diamond shapes with a slit in the center. Frying required careful temperature control, too hot and the cookies browned before cooking through, too cool and they absorbed excessive grease, becoming heavy rather than light and crispy. Experienced bakers tested the oil with small dough scraps, adjusting heat until cookies puffed immediately and turned golden in 60 seconds, draining on paper towels, then dusting with powdered sugar while still warm created the traditional finish. These cookies stayed crispy for days but were best eaten within a week before they began absorbing moisture from the air. Keeps 1 week in airtight containers. The sight of figure-8-shaped cookies announced Scandinavian heritage and mastery of rolling dough into perfect ropes that maintained uniform thickness and didn't break when twisted into traditional pretzel shapes. Kringla cost $2 and produced 48 soft cookies, 1 cup of sugar, half cup of butter, half cup of sour cream, 2 eggs, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 3 cups of flour, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, half teaspoon of baking soda, and 1/4 teaspoon of salt created soft dough that chilled before shaping. The shaping required practice, pinching off walnut-sized pieces, rolling them into 6-inch ropes of uniform thickness, then twisting into figure-8s or pretzels. Uneven rolling created cookies that baked unevenly, with thin sections becoming hard, while thick sections stayed soft. Patient grandmothers rolled each rope carefully, checking thickness along its length before shaping. The sight of wreath-shaped cookies with pearl sugar sparkling on top announced Norwegian Christmas traditions and access to specialty ingredients like pearl sugar that regular grocery stores didn't stock, requiring trips to Scandinavian specialty shops. Berlinerkranser cost $3 and produced 60 small wreath cookies, 1 cup of butter, 2/3 cup of sugar, 2 hard-boiled egg yolks pressed through a sieve, 2 raw egg yolks, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 2½ cups of flour created rich dough that had to be chilled before shaping. The hard-boiled egg yolks were essential. They created the characteristic tender, almost sandy texture that separated these from ordinary butter cookies. Pressing them through a fine mesh sieve required patience and elbow grease, creating smooth paste that incorporated into the dough without lumps. Shaping required rolling small pieces of dough into 4-inch ropes, forming them into circles and joining the ends carefully so they wouldn't separate during baking. Brushing with beaten egg white and sprinkling with pearl sugar before baking created the traditional sparkly coating that made these cookies look like jewelry. The pearl sugar was crucial. Regular granulated sugar melted and disappeared, while pearl sugar maintained its shape and crunch, creating textural contrast against the tender cookie. Grandmothers ordered it by mail if local stores didn't carry it. Keeps 2 weeks in airtight containers. 10 cookies down, 1/3 finished. Notice the pattern? Hard-boiled eggs pressed through sieves. Dough rolled into perfect ropes. Deep frying requiring temperature control. Specialty ingredients ordered by mail. These recipes demanded skills modern bakers never developed and patience modern life doesn't allow. 20 more cookies await. The sight of star-shaped cookies with glossy white icing announced German Christmas traditions and willingness to work with challenging meringue-based dough that required beating egg whites to stiff peaks before computers existed to tell you when you'd beaten them enough. Zimtsterne cost $4 and produced 40 large star cookies, 4 egg whites beaten to stiff peaks, 2 cups of powdered sugar, 2½ cups of finely ground almonds, 2 tablespoons of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon of lemon zest, created dough that was sticky, fragile, and difficult to roll without it sticking to everything it touched. The ground almonds had to be extremely fine. Coarse grinding created grainy texture and made the dough impossible to roll smoothly. Patient grandmothers ground blanched almonds in hand crank cranked grinders, creating almond meal fine as flour. Later generations used food processors, but overprocessing released oils that made the dough greasy. Rolling this dough required heavy use of powdered sugar on the work surface and rolling pin. The dough stuck tenaciously to everything, cutting star shapes with cookie cutters, carefully transferring them to baking sheets without distorting the points, and brushing tops with reserved meringue created the traditional white glaze. Baking at low temperature dried the cookies without browning them, preserving their pale color. The meringue topping cracked slightly during baking, creating the characteristic appearance. These cookies were chewy rather than crispy, with intense cinnamon flavor and almond richness that made them seem more like confections than cookies. They required humid storage. Too dry, and they became hard. Too moist, and they turned sticky. Keeps 2 weeks in airtight containers. The sight of crescent-shaped cookies buried in powdered sugar announced Greek heritage and New Year's traditions that connected immigrant families to Mediterranean homelands they'd left behind, but refused to forget in their American kitchens. Kourabiedes cost $3 and produced 70 crescents, 1 pound of butter beaten until fluffy, half cup of powdered sugar, 1 egg yolk, 2 tablespoons of brandy, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 4 cups of flour, 1 cup of finely chopped toasted almonds created rich dough that required extensive beating to incorporate enough air for proper texture. The butter had to be beaten for at least 10 minutes by hand or 5 minutes with an electric mixer, creating pale, fluffy mixture that almost doubled in volume. This beating was essential. Insufficiently beaten butter created dense cookies rather than the characteristic light, crumbly texture. Experienced bakers could tell by sight when the butter reached proper consistency, becoming almost white and holding peaks when the beater was lifted. Shaping the dough into crescents required gentle handling. Too much manipulation made them tough. The sound of twice-baked cookies being sliced announced Jewish baking traditions and connection to European roots, where these almond-studded biscotti-like cookies accompanied tea in households that valued education, conversation, and maintaining cultural identity despite pressure to assimilate. Mandelbrot cost $3 and produced 60 slices, 3 eggs, 1 cup of sugar, 3/4 cup of oil, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 1 teaspoon of almond extract, 3 cups of flour, 1 tablespoon of baking powder, half teaspoon of salt, 1½ cups of slivered almonds, created dough that formed into logs, baked until firm, sliced, and baked again until crispy. The twice baking was essential. It created the characteristic dry, crunchy texture that allowed these cookies to keep for months without spoiling. The first baking firmed the logs enough to slice cleanly without crumbling. Cooling the logs for 10 minutes before slicing prevented the knife from dragging and tearing the still soft interior. Slicing required a sharp serrated knife and gentle sawing motion. Pressing down crushed the logs and created ragged edges. The sight of delicate pastry squares folded around jewel-toned fruit fillings announced Polish heritage and mastery of working with cream cheese dough that required chilling, patience, and gentle handling to create the flaky, tender texture that separated excellent Kolaczki from disappointing imitations. Kolaczki cost $5 and produced 72 filled cookies, 8 ounces of butter, 8 ounces of cream cheese, 2 cups of flour, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, created rich dough that had to be refrigerated overnight before rolling. Various fruit preserves, apricot, prune, raspberry, cherry, provided traditional fillings. The overnight chilling was non-negotiable. Warm dough was impossible to roll without it sticking to every surface and tearing when handled. Patient grandmothers made the dough a day ahead, wrapping it tightly and refrigerating it until firm enough to roll smoothly. Rolling required working quickly with small portions while keeping the rest refrigerated. The dough softened rapidly at room temperature, becoming sticky and unmanageable. manageable. Cutting into 2-inch squares, placing half teaspoon of filling in the center, and folding 2 opposite corners to the middle created the traditional shape. Pinching the corners together ensured they stayed closed during baking rather than unfolding and spilling filling. Baking until barely golden, cooling completely, and dusting heavily with powdered sugar created the traditional finish. These cookies were extremely tender, almost melting on the tongue, with buttery richness and tart fruit filling that balanced the sweet dough. This recipe represents why your grandmother spent 80 hours making Christmas cookies. The aroma of cinnamon-scented butter cookies announced Mexican-American heritage and the blending of European butter cookie techniques with New World spices that created uniquely American Christmas traditions in Southwestern households. Mexican wedding cookies cost $2 and produced 60 snowball-shaped cookies. 1 cup of butter, ½ cup of powdered sugar, 2 teaspoons of vanilla, 2 cups of flour, 1 cup of finely chopped pecans, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon mixed into the dough, and additional cinnamon mixed with powdered sugar for coating created spiced variation on Russian tea cakes. The cinnamon in the dough was what distinguished these from their European cousins. It added warmth and complexity that plain butter cookies lacked. The pecans had to be chopped extremely fine, almost to powder, so they distributed evenly without creating lumps that distorted the round shape. Rolling the dough into perfect spheres required gentle hands. Too much handling warmed the butter and made the cookies spread during baking instead of maintaining their round shape. Baking until set but not browned, rolling warm cookies in cinnamon-powdered sugar mixture, cooling completely, and rolling again created the thick spiced coating. These cookies represented the cultural blending that defined American Southwest, European technique, Mexican spicing, and American ingredients combining to create something new that honored multiple traditions simultaneously. Grandmothers who made these were often bilingual, teaching grandchildren Spanish words while they rolled cookie dough together. 15 cookies down, halfway through. Egg whites beaten by hand. Dough aged overnight. Twice-baked slices. Cream cheese pastry folded individually. Cultural traditions preserved through recipes. The sight of delicate, lace-like tubes filled with whipped cream announced British heritage and mastery of working with molten sugar syrup that had to be shaped within seconds before it hardened, requiring timing, speed, and fearlessness around hot sugar that could cause serious burns. Brandy snaps cost $4 and produced 36 elegant tubes. ½ cup of butter, ½ cup of sugar, ½ cup of golden syrup or corn syrup, ½ cup of flour, 1 teaspoon of ground ginger, 1 tablespoon of brandy, 1 teaspoon of lemon juice created thin batter that spread into lacy circles during baking. The timing was critical, baking until deep golden brown, cooling for exactly 30 seconds until firm enough to lift but still pliable. Then quickly rolling each cookie around a wooden spoon handle to create tubes before they hardened completely. Too soon, and the cookies tore. Too late, and they became rigid and shattered when you tried to roll them. Experienced bakers worked in small batches, baking only 4 cookies at a time so they could shape each one before it cooled past the point of flexibility. This meant standing at the oven for an hour, baking and shaping in endless cycles, never able to step away or lose focus. The filled version required piping sweetened whipped cream into the tubes just before serving. Filled too early, the moisture from the cream softened the crispy cookies into soggy tubes. This last-minute filling meant grandmothers were still working in the kitchen while guests arrived, creating the kind of dramatic timing that modern hostesses avoid. The sight of crackled-top almond cookies announced French baking traditions and the kind of technical precision that required understanding humidity, oven temperature, and almond grinding fineness at a level that most American home bakers never achieved. Macarons de Nancy cost $6 and produced 40 cookies, 2 cups of finely ground blanched almonds, 2 cups of powdered sugar, 4 egg whites, quarter teaspoon of almond extract created simple ingredient list that belied the extreme difficulty of execution. The almonds had to be ground to powder fineness without releasing their oils. This required patience and the right equipment. Too coarse and the cookies had grainy texture. Too much processing and the oils made the mixture greasy and impossible to pipe. Experienced bakers pulsed almonds with powdered sugar in small batches, checking texture constantly. The egg whites required beating to soft peaks, not stiff, which made the cookies crack excessively, and not loose, which made them spread too much. Folding the almond mixture into the whites required exactly the right amount of mixing, too little, and the cookies didn't spread properly. Too much, and they became flat and lost their characteristic texture. Piping uniform circles, letting them sit at room temperature for 30 minutes to develop a skin. Then baking at precise temperature created cookies with smooth tops, crackled surfaces, and chewy interiors. The sitting time was essential, but humidity-dependent. Humid days required longer sitting, dry days shorter. These cookies represented 80 hours of Christmas baking because the first batch usually failed, requiring multiple attempts to achieve proper texture. Grandmothers who mastered these earned genuine respect from other bakers who understood the difficulty. The sight of lacy caramel cookies with chocolate backing announced Italian heritage and willingness to work with molten caramel, sliced almonds, and melted chocolate in combination that required 3 separate techniques: careful timing and acceptance that some batches would fail despite perfect execution. Florentines cost $8 and produced 30 large cookies. Half cup of butter, half cup of sugar, quarter cup of honey, quarter cup of heavy cream, 1½ cups of sliced almonds, quarter cup of chopped candied orange peel, quarter cup of flour, 8 ounces of dark chocolate for coating created expensive ingredient list that made failed batches genuinely painful. The caramel mixture had to be cooked to exactly the right temperature. Too cool, and the cookies spread excessively and never set properly. Too hot, and they burned before the centers cooked. Stirring constantly while the mixture bubbled required attention and arm strength, preventing scorching on the bottom of the pan. Dropping spoonfuls onto baking sheets lined with parchment, spreading them slightly, and baking until deep golden created lacy cookies that were chewy in the center with crispy edges. Cooling completely before attempting to remove them from the parchment prevented them from tearing apart. Melting chocolate, spreading it on the flat side of each cookie, and using a fork to create wavy lines before the chocolate set created the traditional finish. The sight of crescent-shaped pastries filled with cinnamon, nuts, and jam announced Jewish baking traditions and mastery of cream cheese dough that required the same patience and technique as Kolaczki, but with different shaping that created more surface area for caramelized filling. Rugelach cost $5 and produced 64 crescents. 8 ounces of butter, 8 ounces of cream cheese, 2 tablespoons of sugar, quarter teaspoon of salt, 2 cups of flour, created dough that had to be refrigerated overnight. Filling of cinnamon sugar, finely chopped walnuts, raisins, and apricot jam provided traditional flavors. The overnight chilling was essential for the same reasons as Kolaczki. Warm dough was impossible to roll smoothly. Dividing the chilled dough into 4 portions, rolling each into a circle, spreading with jam, sprinkling with cinnamon sugar mixture and nuts, cutting into wedges like a pizza, and rolling from the wide end to the point, created the crescent shape. The rolling had to be tight. Loose rolling created gaps where filling leaked out during baking, creating burnt spots on the baking sheet and cookies that looked messy rather than professional. Experienced bakers rolled firmly, tucking the filling in as they went, creating tight spirals that held together during baking. Brushing with egg wash and sprinkling with additional cinnamon sugar before baking created caramelized exterior that made these cookies irresistible. The combination of flaky pastry, sweet filling, and crunchy caramelized coating created complex textures in every bite. These cookies represented hours of work, making dough the night before, rolling and filling 4 separate circles. The sound of dough crackling in hot oil announced Polish Christmas traditions and willingness to deep-fry delicate pastries that puffed into crispy bows, creating grease spatters and lingering cooking smells that filled the house for days but were accepted as part of authentic holiday preparation. Chrusciki cost $3 and produced 120 small bow ties. 6 egg yolks, 3 tablespoons of sugar, 3 tablespoons of sour cream, 3 tablespoons of rum or brandy, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 2 cups of flour, 1/4 teaspoon of salt created stiff dough that had to be rolled paper thin and cut into rectangles with a slit in the center. The signature bow shape came from pulling one end of the rectangle through the center slit, creating a twisted appearance that allowed even frying. Rolling the dough thin enough required strength and a heavy rolling pin. Thick dough created heavy, greasy cookies instead of the characteristic light, crispy texture. Frying required maintaining precise oil temperature. Too hot, and the cookies browned before the interior cooked. Too cool, and they absorbed excessive oil, becoming heavy and unpleasant. Testing with small dough scraps, adjusting heat constantly, and frying only a few at a time required attention and experience. Draining on paper towels, then dusting heavily with powdered sugar while still warm, created the traditional finish. These cookies stayed crispy for only a few days before absorbing moisture from the air, requiring careful storage in airtight containers with waxed paper between layers. The rum in the dough wasn't just flavoring, it inhibited gluten development, creating more tender texture that shattered when you bit into it. Keeps 3 days in airtight containers. The aroma of ginger, cinnamon, and cloves announced Swedish Christmas traditions and the kind of spice-forward baking that Scandinavian grandmothers perfected, creating cookies so thin they were almost translucent, so crispy they shattered at the slightest pressure. Swedish ginger cookies cost $2 and produced 150 paper-thin cookies, 3/4 cup of butter, 1 cup of sugar, 1 egg, 1 tablespoon of molasses, 2 cups of flour, 2 teaspoons of baking soda, 2 teaspoons of ground ginger, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of ground cloves, 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Created dough that had to be refrigerated overnight before rolling. The overnight chilling was essential. It allowed the spices to permeate the dough completely and made it firm enough to roll extremely thin without tearing. Patient grandmothers rolled this dough until you could almost see through it, creating cookies that baked in just 6 to 8 minutes and emerged from the oven crispy as glass. Rolling this thin required a light touch and heavily floured surface. Too much pressure tore the dough, while too little flour caused it to stick and tear when lifted. Experienced bakers developed the feel for proper thickness, creating cookies so delicate they seemed more like edible lace than substantial food. Cutting shapes with cookie cutters, carefully transferring them to baking sheets without stretching or distorting them, and watching them closely during baking prevented burning that happened in seconds if you looked away. These cookies went from perfectly baked to burned in 30 seconds, requiring constant attention. Traditional Swedish families made these in enormous quantities, storing them in tins where they stayed crispy for weeks. Children competed to see who could eat them whole without breaking them. a nearly impossible feat given their extreme fragility. The intense spice flavor developed over several days of storage, mellowing slightly but remaining assertively gingery. Keeps 3 weeks in airtight containers. The distinctive licorice aroma of anise announced Italian Christmas traditions and the kind of bold flavoring that polarized people. You either loved these cookies intensely or refused to eat them, with no middle ground possible given the assertive taste. Italian anise cookies cost $3 and produced 72 soft cake-like cookies. Half cup of butter, 1 cup of sugar, 3 eggs, 1 tablespoon of anise extract, 3 cups of flour, 1 tablespoon of baking powder, 1/4 teaspoon of salt created dough that dropped from spoons onto baking sheets, simple glaze of powdered sugar, milk, and additional anise extract, topped with colored sprinkles, provided traditional finish. These cookies were meant to be soft and cake-like rather than crispy, with texture more similar to small cakes than traditional cookies. The key was not over-baking, pulling them from the oven when they were just set, but still pale, preserved their tender texture. Over-baking created dry, hard cookies that lost their characteristic softness. Glazing, while still warm, allowed the icing to soak in slightly, creating cookies that were sweet throughout rather than just on top. Adding colored sprinkles while the glaze was wet ensured they stuck properly, creating the festive appearance that made these cookies recognizable at any Italian-American Christmas gathering. The anise flavor was intentionally strong. These weren't subtle cookies. Italian grandmothers who made them were unapologetic about the assertive flavoring, understanding that these cookies represented their heritage and weren't meant to please everyone. Serving them announced cultural pride and refusal to completely assimilate into bland American food culture. Children in Italian families either grew up loving these cookies or avoiding them entirely, with preferences often dividing along generational lines as younger family members adopted more Americanized tastes. Keeps 1 week in airtight containers, soften over time. The sight of cookies embossed with windmills, ships, and other Dutch symbols announced Netherlands' heritage and ownership of carved wooden molds or special rolling pins that pressed intricate designs into spice cookie dough, creating edible art that connected immigrant families to European homelands. Dutch speculaas cost $3 and produced 60 large embossed cookies. 1 cup of butter, 1½ cups of brown sugar, 1 egg, 2 tablespoons of milk, 3 cups of flour, 2 teaspoons of speculaas spice blend, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, cardamom, white pepper. 1 teaspoon of baking powder created dough that had to be refrigerated before pressing into molds. The spice blend was crucial. Authentic speculaas required the specific combination of spices in precise proportions. Many Dutch grandmothers made their own spice blends, toasting whole spices and grinding them fresh to create more intense flavor than pre-ground spices could provide. Pressing the chilled dough into carved wooden molds required firm, even pressure to imprint the designs clearly. Too light and the details barely showed. Too hard and the dough stuck in the mold's crevices, tearing when you tried to remove it. Experienced bakers dusted molds lightly with flour, pressed firmly once, and used a knife edge to trim excess dough flush with the mold edges before inverting and tapping to release the embossed cookies. Baking until firm but not overly browned preserved the design details that were the cookie's main feature. These cookies were quite hard and crispy, meant to be dunked in coffee or tea rather than eaten plain. Traditional Dutch families made these for St. Nicholas Day in early December, but Dutch-American families often made them for Christmas as well, adapting Old World traditions to New World holiday schedules. Keeps 1 month in airtight containers. The sound of the krumkake iron clamping shut, announced Norwegian heritage and ownership of specialized equipment that most American kitchens didn't have, creating delicate cone-shaped cookies that required shaping while hot, working quickly before they cooled and became rigid. Norwegian krumkake cost $4 and produced 48 cones, 3 eggs, half cup of sugar, half cup of melted butter, half cup of heavy cream, 1 cup of flour, 1 teaspoon of vanilla or cardamom created thin batter that cooked in the special iron, creating large, thin, waffle-patterned circles that had to be shaped immediately. The krumkake iron required heating over a stovetop burner or plugging in if electric, then maintaining consistent temperature throughout the baking process. Too cool and the cookies stayed pale and soft, too hot and they burned before cooking through. Experienced bakers developed instincts for proper temperature, adjusting heat constantly, spooning batter onto the hot iron, closing it, and cooking for 30 to 60 seconds created thin, crispy circles. Opening the iron, quickly removing the hot cookie, and immediately rolling it around a cone-shaped form before it cooled and hardened required speed and heat-resistant fingers. Hesitation meant the cookie cooled past the point of flexibility, becoming rigid and shattering if you tried to roll it. Grandmothers often recruited helpers for krumkake making, one person operating the iron while another shaped the hot cookies, creating assembly line efficiency that made the tedious process slightly faster. These delicate cones could be filled with whipped cream just before serving, though most families ate them plain, appreciating their delicate crispness and subtle flavor. The cardamom variation was traditional in some regions, vanilla in others, creating regional variations within Norwegian American communities, keeps 2 weeks unfilled in airtight containers. The sight of crescent-shaped cookies made with ground hazelnuts or almonds announced Austrian heritage and the kind of refined European baking that required ingredients and techniques that separated accomplished bakers from amateurs attempting recipes beyond their skill level. Viennese crescents cost $5 and produced 70 crescents. 1 cup of butter, 1/3 cup of sugar, 2 cups of flour, 1½ cups of finely ground hazelnuts or almonds, 1 teaspoon of vanilla created dough that was extremely short and fragile, requiring gentle handling to prevent it from crumbling. The ground nuts had to be extremely fine. Coarse grinding created grainy texture and made the cookies fall apart. Grinding blanched nuts in hand-cranked grinders or later in food processors required patience and attention to prevent over-processing that released oils and made the mixture pasty. Shaping the dough into crescents required the lightest touch. Too much handling warmed the butter and made the dough fall apart completely. Experienced bakers worked quickly with cool hands, rolling small pieces into ropes and curving them gently into crescent shapes without excessive manipulation. Baking until barely set but not browned, cooling for just a few minutes, then rolling warm cookies in vanilla sugar mixed with vanilla bean seeds or vanilla powder, created the traditional coating. These cookies were extremely fragile, crumbling at the slightest pressure, requiring careful handling and storage. The vanilla sugar coating was essential to the authentic flavor. Plain powdered sugar didn't provide the characteristic taste. Many Austrian grandmothers kept jars of vanilla sugar, made by storing vanilla beans in sugar for weeks, creating intensely flavored sugar that perfumed the cookies. These cookies represented European refinement and the kind of delicate baking that American cookie culture, with its emphasis on sturdy drop cookies, had largely abandoned. Keeps 10 days in airtight containers, handle carefully. Rehook, 25 cookies down, 5 remaining. Paper-thin dough requiring light touch. Specialized irons requiring split-second timing. Ground nuts requiring perfect fineness. Fragile cookies requiring careful handling. These recipes demanded skills that took years to develop and patience that modern bakers simply don't have. 5 final cookies reveal the ultimate peak of grandmother's dedication. The sight of curved, tile-shaped cookies announced French baking sophistication and the kind of precise timing that required shaping cookies over a rolling pin while they were still hot from the oven, working so quickly that you risked burning your fingers in pursuit of perfect curvature. French tuiles cost $5 and produced 36 delicate curved cookies. Half cup of sliced almonds, half cup of sugar, quarter cup of flour, quarter cup of melted butter, 2 egg whites, half teaspoon of vanilla, pinch of salt created thin batter that spread into lacy circles during baking. The batter had to be spread extremely thin on baking sheets, too thick, and the cookies stayed chewy rather than becoming crispy, too thin, and they burned before the centers cooked. Using a small offset spatula to spread each spoonful of batter into a perfect circle required practice and patience, creating uniform cookies that baked evenly. Baking until golden brown around the edges, removing from the oven, and immediately draping each cookie over a rolling pin to create the characteristic curved shape had to happen within seconds. The cookies stayed pliable for only about 30 seconds after leaving the oven, requiring you to work with burned fingers or develop techniques for handling hot cookies without touching them directly. Experienced bakers used thin spatulas to lift the hot cookies and draped them quickly, accepting that some would harden before they could be shaped and would have to be returned to the oven briefly to soften again. This constant cycle of baking, shaping, and sometimes re-softening meant standing at the oven for an hour or more, never able to step away. These cookies were extremely fragile once cooled, shattering if handled roughly. Grandmothers packed them carefully in tins with waxed paper between layers, treating them like the delicate works of art they were. The almond flavor intensified over a day or two of storage, developing complexity that fresh cookies lacked. Keeps 1 week in airtight containers in dry conditions. The sound of twice-baked cookies being sliced with a serrated knife announced Italian heritage and understanding that some cookies were meant to be hard enough to require dunking in coffee or wine, rejecting American preferences for soft cookies in favor of European traditions. Italian biscotti cost $4 and produced 60 slices. 3 eggs, 1 cup of sugar, half cup of melted butter, 1 teaspoon each of vanilla and almond extract, 3 cups of flour, 1½ teaspoons of baking powder, half teaspoon of salt, 1½ cups of whole almonds created dough that formed into logs, baked until firm, sliced, and baked again until completely dry. The whole almonds were essential. Chopped almonds didn't provide the same textural contrast or visual appeal. Toasting the almonds before adding them to the dough intensified their flavor and ensured they stayed crunchy rather than becoming soft during baking. The sight of thick, buttery cookies cut into perfect wedges or fingers announced Scottish heritage and commitment to using the finest butter in generous quantities, creating cookies so rich they seemed more like edible butter than baked goods containing butter. Scottish shortbread cost $4 and produced 24 thick wedges. 1 cup of butter, half cup of sugar, 2 cups of flour, quarter teaspoon of salt created the simplest ingredient list that belied the difficulty of achieving proper texture, sandy, crumbly, yet holding together when bitten. These cookies were meant to be thick and substantial, not thin and delicate. The texture should be sandy and crumbly, almost falling apart in your mouth while still holding together enough to bite. Achieving this texture required understanding butter temperature, mixing times, and baking temperatures at an intuitive level that came only from years of experience. Scottish grandmothers often made these for New Year's celebrations, but Scottish-American families served them at Christmas as well, adapting traditions to American holiday customs. Keeps 2 weeks in airtight containers. The sight of sandwich cookies with jam centers visible through cutout windows announced Austrian heritage and the kind of refined European baking that required making cookies in pairs, cutting decorative shapes from half of them, filling with preserves, and assembling them carefully to create elegant, finished products. Linzer cookies cost $6 and produced 36 sandwich cookies, 1 cup of butter, 2/3 cup of sugar, 1 egg, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 2 cups of flour, 1 cup of finely ground hazelnuts or almonds, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/4 teaspoon of cloves, 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder, raspberry or apricot preserves for filling, powdered sugar for dusting, created. Spreading just the right amount required judgment. Too little looked stingy. Too much oozed out the sides and created sticky messes. These cookies represented hours of work, making dough, chilling it, rolling and cutting 72 individual cookies, cutting centers from half of them, baking, cooling, filling, assembling, and dusting. The finished cookies looked like they came from a European bakery rather than a home kitchen. The spices and nuts in the cookies complemented the fruit preserves perfectly, creating sophisticated flavor combinations that plain butter cookies couldn't match. These cookies softened slightly after a day or two as moisture from the preserves migrated into the cookies, creating tender texture. Keeps 1 week in airtight containers. The sight of large heart-shaped cookies decorated with icing messages announced German Christmas market traditions and the kind of elaborate decorated cookies that required artistic skill beyond basic baking, transforming simple spice cookies into edible greeting cards that expressed affection through food. German Lebkuchen hearts cost $8 and produced 12 large decorated hearts. 3/4 cup of honey, 1/2 cup of molasses, 1 cup of brown sugar, 1 egg, 1 tablespoon of lemon juice, 4 cups of flour, 2 teaspoons each of cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and allspice, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/2 cup of chopped candied citrus peel, 1/2 cup of chopped almonds created dough that had to age overnight before rolling. The overnight aging was essential. It allowed the spices to permeate the dough and made it easier to roll without sticking. Rolling to 1/2-inch thickness, cutting large heart shapes, baking until firm, cooling completely, and decorating with royal icing piped in elaborate designs and messages created cookies that were as much art as food. The royal icing had to be the right consistency. Too thin, and it ran off the cookies. Too thick, and it wouldn't pipe smoothly through decorating tips. Experienced bakers mixed it to soft peak consistency, adjusting with drops of water or spoonfuls of powdered sugar until it flowed smoothly but held its shape, piping borders, writing messages like Frohe Weihnachten, Merry Christmas, or names, adding decorative flourishes required steady hands and artistic sensibility. These cookies weren't meant to be eaten immediately. They were displayed, admired, and eventually consumed after serving their purpose as edible decorations and personalized gifts. Traditional German Christmas markets sold these hearts in enormous sizes, hung on ribbons around people's necks. German-American grandmothers made smaller versions but maintained the tradition of elaborate decoration that made each cookie unique. The cookies softened over time, developing chewy texture that made them easier to eat than when fresh and hard. Which of these 30 forgotten Christmas cookies did your grandmother make? Comment the cookie name and your state. I'm mapping where these mid-century baking traditions survived longest and which regions abandoned them first as American cookie culture shifted toward simplicity and convenience over artistry and patience. If you made it through all 30 cookies, you understand that the women who created and perfected these recipes weren't just baking. They were preserving cultural identities, maintaining connections to homelands they'd left behind, teaching patience and precision to daughters and granddaughters, and creating the kind of beauty that required genuine sacrifice of time and effort. They mastered techniques that modern baking has abandoned. Cookie presses requiring arm strength, dough aged overnight or longer, specialized irons heated over stovetops, deep frying requiring temperature control, twice baking creating extreme hardness, working with molten sugar requiring fearlessness, shaping hot cookies within seconds, rolling dough paper-thin without tearing, grinding nuts to powder fineness, piping royal icing in elaborate designs. These techniques required years to develop. You couldn't learn them from cookbooks or YouTube videos. You had to stand beside your grandmother, watching her hands, feeling the dough, understanding by touch and instinct what words couldn't adequately describe. You had to fail repeatedly, burning batches, tearing delicate dough, mistiming the shaping of hot cookies, before you developed the skills that made these recipes possible. These 30 cookies represent more than just holiday treats. They're historical documents showing how immigrant families maintained cultural identities through food when pressure to assimilate was intense. They're evidence of technical skill and artistic sensibility that home baking once required and valued. They're connections to women who understood that the effort itself communicated love in ways that buying pre-made cookies never could. The Spritz cookies announcing ownership of proper equipment, the Feffanosa maintaining German spice traditions, the Pizzelles requiring Italian specialty irons, the Springerle preserving carved wooden molds as family heirlooms, the Sandbakkelse demanding patience to press dough into 72 individual tins, the Fattigmann requiring fearlessness around hot oil, the Zimtsterne working with challenging meringue-based dough, the Kourabiedes buried in powdered sugar announcing Greek heritage, the Mandelbrot twice baked until hard enough for dunking, the Kolaczki folded around fruit preserves with cream cheese pastry. Each cookie tells a story about women who refused to completely abandon their cultural roots despite living in America. Women who taught their children words in languages other than English while they rolled cookie dough together. Women who maintained holiday traditions that connected their families to places they'd never see again. Women who understood that food is how we say, "I remember where we came from," when younger generations are forgetting. From their kitchens to yours. Don't let them forget what our grandmothers knew about patience, precision, and the kind of love that shows up as 80 hours spent making Christmas cookies. These recipes deserve to be remembered, celebrated, and passed down to the next generation before the last women who made them take this knowledge to their graves. When you make those Spritz cookies this Christmas, you're connecting to thousands of women who stood at their counters in the 1950s, pressing dough through cookie presses, creating perfect shapes that announced their commitment to proper baking. When you roll Feffanosa in powdered sugar, you're participating in German traditions that survived immigration, world wars, and pressure to abandon everything that marked you as foreign. When you shape hot Pizzelles or krumkake, you're proving that some techniques can't be replaced by convenience, that beauty sometimes requires accepting the risk of burned fingers. These aren't just quaint old recipes. They're living history. They're edible connections to people who came before us. They're proof that creating memorable experiences for people we love has always required genuine sacrifice, and that the kind of hospitality that makes people feel truly valued can't be bought pre-made at any price, no matter how much bakeries charge for their mass-produced Christmas cookies. So, as you plan your Christmas baking, consider adding 1 or 2 of these forgotten cookies to your tins. Not just for nostalgia, though that has value, but because they work, because they're delicious, because they connect you to rich traditions of cultural preservation through food, and because making them proves that you value the kind of patience, precision, and dedication that modern life has trained us to consider outdated rather than admirable. Share these recipes with your daughters. Teach your sons that baking is art rather than chore. Pass along stories of grandmothers who maintained cultural identities through food, who taught patience through cookie making, who created beauty that required 80 hours of labor, because they understood that some things are worth doing properly even when easier alternatives exist, that spending 3 weeks making Christmas cookies isn't inefficient, it's the point. That the love that shows up as paper-thin Springerle embossed with carved wooden molds or delicate tuiles shaped over rolling pins while still hot from the oven can't be expressed any other way. These 30 cookies carry forward a legacy of cultural preservation, technical mastery, and genuine dedication that defined immigrant families building new lives in America while refusing to completely abandon the traditions that made them who they were. They teach us lessons that remain relevant today about maintaining connections to our roots, valuing patience over convenience, and understanding that true love requires sacrifice of time and effort that modern culture has trained us to avoid.